Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. The title of this episode, the 17% threshold effect, comes from an effect I've described a lot of times on the InfoMullet. And I actually discussed it before the elections when I did my forecasts on post-election mass violence and instability. And the 17% threshold effect is kind of a notional number. It's not a hard number. You can't go out in an article and find this as science, but it's a notional number that's the difference between the risk of clandestine terror networks morphing into what an insurgency. And we'll get in, when we get into the deconflicting the conflict terms, we'll get into a little bit more what the difference is between those. But the 17% threshold effect, what that means is if someone is planning an act, let's say they want to plan a bombing, right? The 17% threshold effect says if that group has either popular support or intimidation of the population, that 17 people out of 100 who know about that act being planned, but don't tell the police about it, you have an insurgency. There's enough popular support, you have an insurgency. If the bomb goes off and people recognize the picture that's taken from a camera and 17 out of 100 people recognize that person but don't say anything, that's where you get between the difference between a clandestine terror group and an insurgency. And the reason that the reason we call it clandestine terror group is below that 17% threshold effect, you're having to hide everything you do, not just from the law enforcement, but from everyone around you, your neighbors, your family, your friends. You're having to act in a clandestine way. And it's very difficult, very resource intensive. It's why terror groups struggle, and they are really limited in the impact they can have. I mean, they can generate a lot of terror, they can generate a lot of fear, but they're not as effective because they have to spend enormous amounts of resources to hide from the law enforcement. However, once you cross that threshold, and it's a notional threshold, enough people are either supporting you, they agree with what you're doing, or they're intimidated by you that they won't go to the authorities. And maybe the authorities are part of that 17%. And you can see this when you look historically. So like during the civil rights, some of the murders and the bombings that happened during the civil rights movements in the 1960s, it was decades before those murderers were brought to justice. And that's an example of when you're over that 17% threshold event, you have a lot these illegal criminal activities have a lot more support in the area, and they're easier to sustain. People can stay hidden for years and decades, and that is creating a really dangerous circumstance. But the context I'm talking in now is the January 6th riot, insurrection, and the concern that this represents mass violence and mass instability. Well, this was a test. It was an unplanned experiment. Well, people warned about it, but it certainly wasn't something that was on the schedule. But the January 6th riot is an excellent example of the 17% threshold in effect, and I'm very pleased to say that overall, we are passing that experiment. What I mean by that is if you look at the aftermath of the January 6th insurrection, it clearly shows that we are so far beneath that 17% threshold effect. I mean, and I'll go over the numbers here in a bit. The entire society has grabbed together these images, this data, they're parsing through it, but close relatives, associates, friends, colleagues are identifying people in those to the authorities. And what this means is that if you were in that Capitol, you know, for whatever reason or cause, you're being investigated right now. There's still some people they're trying to identify, but there's 400 active investigations going on right now. And a lot of those people are being turned in, identified, and not just by, you know, people on the net who have an axe to grind, well, you were supporting Trump and I don't like you. They're being turned in by their relatives, brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, co-workers. I know that person. You know, and this is kind of the difference between having a political difference and being willing to support an insurgency. Now, again, the 70% threshold, it can mean both support and intimidation. And I think it doesn't mean that this isn't risky. This isn't to say this wasn't a risky event, but it's to put kind of a context in, at least from someone who studies insurgencies, as to, are we at the tipping point of a mass insurgency or mass instability? And just as I forecast about before the election, I don't think we are. And this was a great example of it, because what you saw after January 6th was this immediate pullback and revulsion of society based on what happened. And I have some numbers here, and I'm going to read just to make sure I get them accurate here. But so As of the last time I checked, the FBI is running 400 individual investigations, so 400 people. Now, we don't know how many people were actually in the Capitol. I've seen estimates from 500 to 1,000. When I looked at the crowds on the videos the days of, I'd estimate there was at most 2,000 to 5,000 around the Capitol. So, you know, ballpark it, 500 to 1,000 people got in the Capitol. There are 400 active investigations going on right now. And some quick demographics of what those are. You know, we worry about how much does this represent a broad swath of society, or how much does it represent certain focus groups that are concerning, like police or military, or are there certain states? And this is kind of a mixed bag. So based on the investigations and the charging documents which have been released and the arrest, of the 400 individuals, only 15 of them so far are prior veterans. So there's this concern that the military has a large presence in this extremist groups. Now, this isn't, remember, this group is the hardcore of the hardcore. They traveled to get there. They decided to go out on a very cold January, and they decided to, clearly, even more so than going to the Capitol, they went into the Capitol. And I mean, I was looking at the video the day of, and you could see people who were on those stairs noping themselves out of that scenario and backing off. So the people who went in, this is a survivor bias that this is the hardest of the hardcore. So this is, you know, it's not reflective of the overall support things like QAnon and stuff like that have. But, you know, 15 veterans, 2 of them were currently serving in Army Reserve. The Army is investigating that. Law enforcement, there were 4 active duty law enforcement within the 400. Now, that's only 1%, but you're thinking these are active duty cops, you know, and I don't know whether they were attacking other cops or things like that, but you would hope that that's a real problem. All 4 of those are no longer police officers. I mean, even though their cases are still ongoing, they're out of the force. So that's, I mean, that's some good news in that they're not heavily penetrated by the military and the law enforcement. Some of the less good news is there were people from 40 different states. The big states: Texas, 18, New York, 14, Florida, 13, California, 10, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, 10 or 9. So you're talking broad geographical distribution, and you have age ranges. It's kind of interesting. The age range here is about 42, so it's kind of like a Gen X insurrection. Like the only time my generation ever got enough cojones to, I mean, we couldn't even keep we couldn't even keep Firefly, but apparently we're behind the insurrection. Great. No, I mean, it's the average age is 42, but it ranges from 20 to 70. And you can see that in the demographics. Like, I do a lot of crowd analysis. You look over those videos, you see wide range of ages. There are only 22 women so far being investigated. I think there was a higher distribution in the videos that I saw, but again, a minority of them were women. Of those 400 investigations, so 206 individuals have been arrested so far and charged. So that's 50% of the investigations. Now, the investigations are not capped. They say when this is said and done, there may be between 500 and 750 individuals charged from this, but they're currently at 400. About 50% have been charged, 160 in federal court and 27 in local court. And you can see in the links that are going with this video, or that if you're watching on YouTube later, I have the links down there. And so this, I think, speaks to that 17% threshold effect. How quickly, this is a massive investigation. They've had over 200,000 different pieces of tips and data. There's been huge volunteer and investigative journalist efforts to put this together. ProPublica, again, there's an archive in the link. They went through all the videos that were scraped off Parler, and in Parler they had the metadata, so they knew the location and the time. They actually organized every single one of those videos from Parler based on whether it was at the rally or outside the Capitol, inside the Capitol, or after the Capitol, and they did it in chronological time. So you can see, if you go up and watch, it's disturbing video in this, so I mean, be careful when you go on there, but they have these things in a row, and you can literally watch it unfold from all the different perspectives. The Faces of Riots was another archive image using machine intelligence and social media scraping. From the 827 videos they had, they identified 6,000 images of faces. Now, this isn't 6,000 people there. I don't think there were that many at the whole event, but 6,000 images. A lot of these have shown up on the FBI's most wanted list. And the FBI's most wanted list is, again, it's a link down there because they've got a couple images, probably 150 more images they're trying to identify, which tells you that there's still more people to be arrested. And this just goes to show the amount of two things at once. Once is society has turned on these people, right? The lawfare blog link at the bottom has every charging indictment. The initial charges on this were very, very serious, ranging from 5 to 20 years. It's going to be illegal trespassing, conspiracy to obstruct Congress. It's going to be carrying a weapon. Those are just, when you're in a federal prosecution scenario, the initial charges they go with are not often the final charges. They're just putting something in to stick you in jail and keep you there. I imagine more charges are going to come out, and we've already seen some charges of insurrection. We've seen some for seditious conspiracy. People are worried about extremists. There were 23 individuals of the 400 have been identified with extremist ties. They come from the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, Three Percenters, Texas Freedom Force, and the QAnon movement, which of course, Buffalo guy is sitting in a jail cell right now, and he was the one actually charged with insurrection. Let's go through. So the 17% effect, there's two things. One of which is society. I think that is fair. But there's another thing. This is a social media heavy environment. I think it was Mike who had this great meme about how, for 20 years, we were fighting a war on terror where our opponents had to use Russian servers that were hosted in caves in Afghanistan, pinging Russian satellites, that they could only use a cell phone once and then had to burn it. They were living in absolute dismal squalor and poverty, hiding from the forces. And here we have an insurrection where a guy is sitting in his living room and going on Parler and posting a video of himself. So I mean, the sheer amount of data, self-implicating, self-incriminating data that has been shared is 17%, maybe a little low. It may now be 30%, because the ability of people, both netizens, sort of volunteer groups, of which a lot of these are, investigative journalists, they use the artificial intelligence, they use machine learning, they use these scraping tools. It really changes that dynamic. So, there's both the social revulsion aspect, but there's also a lot of this technology is making it easier to identify. Let me go through a couple questions here. Thanks everyone for joining. Let's see, here we go. Tony, society's response, immensely reassuring. Yep. Mike's asking if the percentage dependent on the political landscape of each subjective location. You could be below national 17%, but everyone in your town is all in it. Right. Mike's got a very good point. The 17%, first of all, it's a notional number I completely made up. So caveat that. Second, you can do a fractal segmentation, which means at a country level, 17%, but if a state, they're beneath that, then that state's going to be thing. You could even go down to a county, a municipality. I would argue, I view criminal gang activity as a form of insurgent activity. So I would argue in certain criminal gang areas, they have effectively past that threshold whereby intimidation or support, people are not willing to report them to police. This is very common when you see insurgency environments. Part of the reasons insurgencies work is they've either intimidated or have the support of the local population sufficient enough that they're not going to turn them into the police, or they view the police as the enemy. So yes, very much it can be fractally segmented. And I think the example I used of the civil rights activities in the South, in the South during civil rights, they may have passed that threshold and been over 30-40% support for things like the KKK and the anti-civil rights movements. But if you go to a different part of the country, that support may be different. So that it's very good that it's locally, you can fragment these, and a fractal segmentation as far down as you want to go. Ms. Falconberry, do you think President Trump or the individuals at the Capitol will have serious repercussions for their actions, or are these investigations just nominal for now? I mentioned that the charging indictments are all serious federal felonies, usually ranging from 5 to 20 years. That's before they get into adding the ones that are harder to prove, like seditious conspiracy, insurrection. There's assaults of federal officers in there. There's all sorts of fairly serious charge. President Trump, I'm going to leave to when we do an impeachment review, because I've got that mega mullet coming out that's going to talk all about the president himself. And he's a little bit of a different circumstance to look at. Because of he wasn't there physically, but definitely he was involved, in my opinion. Yeah, Laura's pointing out, and Laura's doing a great job. If you haven't followed Laura Mertz, follow her if you can. She does great work. Several of those investigations involving multiple people, so 400 investigations represent more than 400 individuals. Laura, if you have an estimate on the total number of individuals, I know they've only arrested about that 150 to 200 so far, but if you have better numbers, go ahead and put them in. Other questions, comments? Sounds like some of the police officers are reinstated. I'll have to look into that. Firefly shout out, of course. I love mocking Firefly. It's a perfect Gen X thing. No one cares of us. We're such a small generation. They cancel it. Good conversation about grand juries, that some of these charges are going to escalate. Yep, Legal Eagle has good stuff too. Trying to see. Okay, Proud Boys, let's talk real briefly about Proud Boys in Canada, because that came up earlier. Proud Boys, I mentioned, was one of the extremist groups affiliated with it. We'll get into what the definition of domestic terrorism is in one of the media literacies that starts up here, but Canada has declared Proud Boys a domestic terror group, and the US hasn't. And I've gone over this before. I actually did it over the summer when when President Trump was trying to declare Antifa a terrorist group. The US, by habit, precedence, and very good historical reason, does not declare domestic terror groups. And there's a really good reason for this. A lot of people get upset when they think, well, why aren't the Proud Boys declared a domestic terror group? Well, I kind of mentioned some of the reasons. The first is foreign terror groups. The law is, if you provide material aid or support to a foreign terror group, I'm talking ISIS, Al Qaeda, any of those things, you get a federal felony. But a domestic terror group, there's this really fuzzy line between the First Amendment protections on free speech and these groups. So if you say, I support Antifa and I donate $50 to my local Antifa, you know, a lot of people imagine they have a donation booth out there. It's not, doesn't really work that way. I'm just kind of abstracting, right? You provide some sort of material support, you could be charged with a federal felony, but are you really inciting violence and participating in violence when you show ideological political support? And that's an area that gets into this larger discussion of the incitement of a riot and the incitement of an insurrection and things like seditious conspiracy. I'm going to get over those when we go through those deconflicting conflict terms. So, but Canada, very important, Canada's free speech laws are not the same as the United States. I know people are surprised by this. I actually have a lot of Canadian folks that I talk with, I learn a lot from. Shout out to Valeria Panda. She gives a lot of good insights in Canada. You know, Canada's free speech laws are different. And therefore, in Canada, they're able to declare a domestic terror group. Now, the US, even if we said this was a good idea, like in principle, in the US, we used to have this, in the FBI used to have its target list of domestic terror groups. And what they do is they target these civil rights groups, treat them as if they were terrorists, and use the laws against them. So in the US at least, and you know, other countries have this as well to varying degree, there's a history of bad faith actions. When we declare domestic terror groups, we use domestic terrorism laws and say that group is a terror group, that we then use that to target dissent or reform efforts or things. We're not using it for actual terrorists. Now, the way the US handles this and the way the FBI handles it, you'll go on their page and they'll say most wanted individuals, and they'll say types of domestic terror. So they'll report white nationalism as a threat, environmental terrorism as a left-wing extremist threat. They'll report the types of terrorism as movements, and then they'll identify individuals within those movements, because an individual has done acts. An individual, you can distinguish an individual who has done a terrorist act or is suspected of committing a terrorist act. That's a little different than representing ideological support. So the FBI navigates it that way. They list out the terrorist movements and the ones that are of concern, and then they target individuals, and that way they're not naming groups. So I wouldn't expect to see a named terrorist group. And I'd be, as a professional in this field, I don't think we should get in the business of naming terrorist groups, at least domestically. Too much historical misuse and too much ripe abuse. Jennifer's saying, what about judges that let arrested people go to Mexico on vacation before they, instead of saying on house arrest? I'm not, would they count to the 17%? I'm not familiar with that case, but to me, if what you say is true, that judge sounds like, now with bail hearings, it's always really technical. And the thing I try and keep in mind is that it's easy to say we want judges to throw the books at people in bail hearings when it's something like this. But in a lot of other circumstances, we don't want them to throw the books. Now, if those are the facts of the case, that there was nothing else extenuating, they had a previous scheduled vacation to a foreign country, that sounds like a bad idea to me, that judge. You will find judges are parts of these 17%. Law enforcement might be part of the 17%. Each one you're going to have to look at individually, and I don't know that specific case, but from the surface, it sounds like not the best idea. Okay, Ed's saying it was a pre-planned business retreat and with a defined begin-a date. Ed's kind of describing here. There's a good discussion breaking out. I don't want to get into it too much because got to keep moving here. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a muleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.